Novara Media's Ash Sarkar was on BBC Question Time this week. Let's see how it went.
40,000 people in Gaza are dead at least. That's probably an undercount. At least 16,000 children. This week, an independent UN report singled out the destruction of healthcare services in particular and said that Israel could be guilty of the crime of extermination. Israel is facing accusations of genocide at the International Court of Justice. The International Criminal Court also found that Israel had been upholding apartheid and occupation predominantly in the West Bank. This was not about self-defense. It was about using the horrific events of October 7th as an excuse to ethnically cleanse parts of Gaza, to destroy much of the Palestinian population in Gaza, and to redraw the regional map so that Israel comes out on top.
Really important there. Issues we talk about so much on this show. Let's go to a next intervention. Ash was asked about a hypothetical. What would Israeli self-defense have looked like if they hadn't done what they did?
You have to look at what is most in the interests of civilians, both Palestinian and Israeli. The only way forward would be a negotiated settlement. There was ceasefire for hostages deals on the table as far back as last October. And part of the reason why Netanyahu kept rejecting it is because he thought he could push his part further. And so that has endangered Israeli civilians. They've been subject to rocket attacks. It's endangered the lives of those hostages who are still in Gaza.
So what do you think
in utter savagery?
What do you think Israel should have done on the 8th of October?
I think what they should have done is negotiated for those hostages back and also put
negotiate with Hamas.
Yes, and put a
on
peace
the day
process.
After the attack.
Yes, and I'll tell you why. I can hear you laughing in the background. Nothing that the Palestinians have done has resulted in the advancement of their cause. When they've chosen peaceful means, like the Great March of Return a couple of years ago, Israeli forces opened fire and killed over 200 people. Okay.
It's kind of odd the way this. You would negotiate with them the day after October the 7th. I mean, in a hostage situation, you do normally negotiate with the hostage takers kind of straight away. Like the response to a hostage situation isn't normally let's bomb a bunch of cities and kill tens of thousands of civilians. The response that Israel has had to a hostage situation is not normal. We don't want to start seeing that as the precedent which one would expect in such a situation and treat any other proposal as sort of borderline ridiculous. I don't think that would be a particularly helpful or healthy place for us to get to as a society. Also on the panel was conservative author and satirist Konstantin Kissin. Here's how he responded to Ash's points.
The idea that in the wake of the largest terrorist attack in living memory in Israel and around the world, the solution to that was to negotiate with the people who not only did it, not only murdered over 1,000 people and raped women and took hundreds of hostages and dragged them off, but also have continued to commit themselves to repeating that attack again and again and again. The idea that you could possibly negotiate with these people when they continue to promise to repeat their terrorist attack. The man who was killed today was appointed to replace the man who was assassinated, who was the previous leader of Hamas, in order to demonstrate the commitment to this. Jeremy Bowen of the BBC just a few days ago interviewed one of the leaders of Hamas who refused to commit to his two-state solution, who refused to abandon the cause of terrorism. My point to you is there's an option on the table for Hamas, which is to hand back the hostages they've taken, to withdraw the threat that they have given repeatedly through their various leaders, to repeat the terrorist attack of October 7th, to hand over the terrorists who committed those atrocities for justice. And then Israel, of course, must immediately stop hostilities and negotiate for peace.
There is an option that they can immediately do, right? There's an option that Israel could immediately do as well, which is withdraw all of its settlements from the West Bank, which is to say the Palestinians can have a state, which is to end apartheid, right? Both sides could do something which would immediately end the conflict, but neither sides are willing to because, well, I suppose on the Israeli case, they don't need to because they're so strong. And on the Palestinian side, it's because their minimum demands haven't been met. None of them they can live with. Aaron, what did you make of that sort of conversation? It's always a difficult question to get asked, what should they have done on October the 8th? Because it ignores the fact that, well, what Israel probably should have done is not illegally occupy the West Bank and Gaza for 56 years.
Well, that's quite right. I mean, the context here is all important. If you're going to decry terrorism, then talk about the King David hotel bombing by the Irgun and Zionist militias, which killed, I think, 90 plus people. Talk about the fact that hundreds of British personnel were killed in the Mandate of Palestine, all the way up to the Declaration of Independence by Israel. Talk about the fact, Michael, this is really extraordinary, the sergeant's affair. There were two sergeants, two British sergeants. They weren't just killed and hanged by Zionist militias. Their bodies were booby-trapped so that when they would be cut down by their comrades, they would also be harmed. Indeed, one of those men was. This was celebrated by somebody who would go on to become, Menachem Begin, who would go on to become the president of Israel, or the prime minister of Israel, effectively one of the most senior political figures in Israel. And yet, people who say these are wonderful political figures, this is a country whose morals are spick and span, beyond reproach. Apparently, Hamas and Hezbollah are abysmal. You can never work with them. You can never negotiate with them. What do you think the origins of Israel are? What do you think the Irgun was? What do you think the Stern Gang was? What do you think Lehi was? These were all terrorist militias. They killed people, and they got what they wanted. By the way, when those two sergeants were killed and hanged, and like I say, one of their bodies was booby-trapped, once that happened, the Brits, in particular Ernest Bevin, who I think at the time was the Foreign Secretary, said, "We have to get out of here. These people are nuts. We are not capable of engaging with this. There is not, quote unquote, a political solution here because the violence is just so utterly extraordinary. We can't deal with it." So I find it strange that that is what is inflicted on the Palestinian people. And yet, when they adopt the same tactics, by the way, I agree with you, Michael. I think breaking international law is bad, right? I think attacks on civilians is bad. Unarmed civilians is bad. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander? Or no, only one side can do it. You know, I raised this with Konstantin, and he said, well, there was an agreement offered, I think in 46 under the UN. The Palestinians didn't take it. They should have taken it. There's a lesson there. Well, if I said to Konstantin, why aren't you saying the same thing for Ukraine? There's a deal there from Russia. They'll just have the Donbass and Crimea. Why won't Ukraine take it? And if Ukraine won't take it, silly Ukraine. Well, Russia broke international law. Russia invaded the Donbass, right? So he's going to accept that in one instance, but not the other. And of course, that's because I think for people like Konstantin, he views support for Palestine, criticism of Israel, he views that as quote unquote left-coded. He doesn't like the left, therefore he must disagree with that position. And he's come to that conclusion, by the way, like many people, I think, without actually engaging with the history, without engaging with the genealogy of ideas, activism, action that leads to the creation of the State of Israel in the mid-1940s. He is not familiar necessarily with the fact that actually civil rights activism by Palestinians over decades has been destroyed. They should do the peaceful civil rights thing. They do. They did. They got shot. They got assassinated. So the whole conversation is utterly nonsensical in this country, partly because, Michael, we have an institutionally stupid media. Now, there is often very good reporting, but when you actually broadly try and find an in-depth, detailed, intelligent account of what has happened in this country, or this land, I should say, over the last 100 years, it's almost impossible to find. And people think, well, this is a thousands-year-old religious feud. No, it's not. Jews and Muslims and, practicing Jews and Arabs lived in this part of the world quite peacefully, actually, in places like Jaffa, for a pretty long time before the foundation of the State of Israel. It's not thousands of years old. It's actually an outgrowth. It's a direct outgrowth of contemporary 19th century nationalism, of which Zionism is a manifestation. So that the basis of that debate, Michael, I think really rests upon a profoundly ignorant public discourse when it comes to Israel-Palestine. So talking about the details of he said, she said, do you agree with this particular point or that particular point? I think it's a hiding to nothing, because the basis, the foundation for these kinds of discussions are so idiotic that, of course, they don't make sense. So I think the left or people that care about, not even the left, I mean, the fact that it is left coded is a problem. You want the right, you want conservatives to think, actually, this is awful. We need a sensible solution here that preserves human rights and the right to national self-determination. I think we should be resisting this impulse to say he's right on this point or she's wrong on this point. Ash made a great response to Konstantin, by the way, when she said that Israel doesn't recognize a two-state solution. Israel, in its history, has had zero interest in a two-state solution. The reason why the Oslo Accords are being conducted with the PLO and with Yasser Arafat is because there are other factions in Palestinian civil society offering really concrete plans about how to create a workable Palestinian state. But instead, what serves the Israelis was to circumvent those people. By the way, they didn't even work with the PLO. The PLO didn't have a formal delegation at Oslo. So you've got peace. There was a peace negotiations. The PLO weren't allowed to be there. The PLO had to work via, I believe, the Jordanian representatives. It's just a nonsense. Israel is not serious about a two-state solution. It never has been. It wants as much land as possible with as few Palestinians on it as possible. And that Greater Israel point, for many, meant that they wanted the West Bank and Gaza. But of course, it could also expand. There have been Israeli settlers in the Sinai. They were removed in the 80s after a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. But at one point, that also was a part of a Greater Israel. So, like I said, I'll just finish on this point, Michael. The idea that the left support Palestine, therefore I'm right wing, I must support Israel, is so dumb. Read some books on this stuff. Why not start with watching my interview with Ilan Pappé about the rise of the Zionist lobby? Read his books about the Nakba. Read his books about how this conflict has played out over 100 years. It's not that simple.
It's interesting, that Russia point, isn't it? Because I sometimes find it also goes the other way, where people are sort of saying, Ukraine, they should have signed the deal. And then when it comes to Palestine, they say, of course they shouldn't sign any deal. They need to be free from the river to the sea. I do think the inconsistencies go both ways, although I'm not accusing you of that, Aaron, nor Ash.